So welcome everyone. Good afternoon. So our first speaker is Dr. Linda Chandler Scott, who is a professor and extension urban horticulturist in the Department of Horticulture at Washington State University. Dr. Chalker Scott has a PhD in horticulture from Oregon State University and is an ISA certified arborist and an ASCA consulting arborist. She conducts research in applied plant and soil sciences, publishing the results in scientific articles and university extension fact sheets. She is currently the editor of WCISA's Western Arborist Magazine, the Journal of NACAA, and the editor-in-chief for Compost Science and Utilization. She is also actively involved in enhancing the scientific literacy for her audiences by teaching them how to assess the credibility of information from print and online resources. Thank you, Dr. Chalker Scott. The floor is yours. Okay? We can start now.
Thank you, Shimad. I appreciate that. And greetings to everybody from Tacoma, Washington. I am probably on the other side of the country from most of you. There is a handout that is available on either the chat. I think the chat is where Rich is at. Link it up. And then you'll be able to download that and see notes from the talk as well as some extra bonus material that you're welcome to download and share with whoever you like. So it's always fun to talk to groups that are looking at pest control, and the pests that I'm focusing on, of course, mulches are weeds. So as this opening slide shows, we've got a medley of different mulches there. We've got some plastic, white plastic, we've got some black plastic, we've got some lava rock, and we've got some pea gravel. And yet we can see that there's weeds coming up all over the place. And so this is the issue, is all myths around mulching, about mulch choices. And we end up oftentimes having lots of weeds, but not many of our desirable plants. So what I'm going to start with today is looking at the different types of mulches, just briefly, the mulch choices that are there, and give you my analysis of whether they're good choices or bad choices for landscapes. I'll mention POW mulches, and that's kind of my acronym for poor oxygen and water. So these are mulches that restricts the movement of oxygen and water into the soil. And I just like the visual of that being a POW towards everything that's living in the soil. Then I'll mention the research that I've done and others have done on arborist wood chip mulches as a landscape mulch. And of course, we'll finish up with questions that you might have. It should be a very hard question to figure out why we mulch, but it's worth looking at least briefly. There's lots of reasons that I give in the handout, and I'm going to just talk about some of those, not all of those. There's lots of choices of mulches, and we'll go over some of these I have pictured above. One of the best things is that it protects the soil from compaction and disturbance. So soil's covered up with something, it's not going to be likely to be eroded or compacted. It protects the soil environment and obviously everything living in the soil, including plant roots. It reduces weeds if it's a well-chosen mulch, and it can be very beautiful. So that's the nice thing, is that you can make this or use the mulches as kind of an aesthetic statement, which a lot of times, especially for clients, if you're working with clients of any sort, is an important part. So the things I consider to be acceptable mulches are living mulches, number one. So in an agricultural system, this might be a cover crop or a home vegetable garden. In a more of a landscaped area, those would be ground covers. Inorganic mulches, there's a lot of choices there too, and some of them are very pretty, some of them are not so much. And they're fine to use. They've got some limitations, but they're not bad in the way that I consider mulches to be bad. And finally, there is coarse organic mulches. And so I'm including in this description bark in a limited way. So any kind of bark mulch, but in a limited way. Leaves, nutshells, also in a limited way. Pine needles, straw, and wood chips. Those are some examples of things I consider to be coarse, at least coarse-ish. We'll talk about what I mean by limited when we get to talking about those particular mulches. So living mulches, as I said, can be not only functional, but beautiful. There's many choices. Many of them are resistant to, or at least tolerate some amount of walking. So you can have things that are not only beautiful, but functional in terms of staying alive and protecting the soil. You can do all kinds of mixtures. I particularly like the one on the left here, which is from a landscape in Dallas, where they had used stone pavers as a way to have a permeable driveway, and then they interspersed that with different kinds of ground covers. So there is no bare soil. The soil is protected, but yet it's functional in terms of providing a driving space, and it's also really attractive. And then in the other two, you can see that there's interspersing of different types of mulch covers. The thing that's the same with all of these is you do not see bare soil anywhere. That's not to say you can't have some bare soil for ground nesting insects, but in terms of things that are visible and subject to compaction, there's no bare soil. I'm going to mention, some things about inorganic mulches that are worth considering. Now, I live in the rainy part of Washington State, and inorganic mulches are not the best choice, and you'll see why. They're great for dry environments. And so, as in this landscape, which is in Palm Desert, California, which obviously by its name, is a desert environment, using a stone mulch is natural. It's what native plants are adapted to, and they do protect the soil from a number of things, including heat. Surprisingly enough, stone mulches do not heat up the soil, and they will keep weeds out, and they help retain water and all the other things that mulches are supposed to do. However, in a wetter environment like where I live, they will become weedy. This is a classic example. If you have a stone mulch next to a sidewalk, which is really common in urban areas, the stones can keep out many of the weeds, but the problem is with the water washing off the sidewalk, either from irrigation or from rain, you're going to have it collecting there at the edge. There's going to be weed seeds there. They're going to take off. And then the problem is it's not really easy to pull them. And so taking care of weeds that appear in storm mulches can be difficult to do mechanically and oftentimes has to be done chemically. Here's a really bad example of using inorganic mulches in a wet environment. And this is all concrete rubble. So you can see that it's been put down at actually quite a depth. It's probably close to about 8 inches deep there. But the bindweed and the horsetail have eagerly taken over and gotten through all of those cracks. And now you get to the point, what do you do with it? As many of you probably know, it's pretty much impossible to spray anything on horsetail except a flamethrower. And so trying to control any of these chemically is also a problem. So you're pretty much stuck now because you've got this very heavy cobble layer that you can't get through. And so you just either accept the fact you've got weeds or you tear everything out and start over with another type of mulch. There are several things that I consider to be unacceptable just because they don't do all the things that mulches are supposed to do in terms of benefiting soils and plants. Synthetic mulches are not only damaging to the environment to manufacture, they're damaging to the environment to have on the soil in the first place. This includes any kind of landscape fabric, any kind of plastics, and rubber. Regardless of what the tags say on the packages, they do not control weeds permanently. There is no such thing as permanent weed control. I think we all know that. Whatever you're using for weed control is going to have to be either reapplied or otherwise dealt with, because eventually weeds will find their way through. Synthetics will damage soil and plant health, as I mentioned. And if you use the sheet mulches, like the fabrics and plastics, you're going to have those poor oxygen and water transfer conditions. So the POW, right, to the soil life. Rubber mulches on top of all this are flammable and just should not be a choice for any landscape whatsoever. I'll walk that back a little bit and say if you're dealing with things like children's playgrounds or other places where you have or rubberized sidewalks or something like that's different, and that's not what I would include as being a landscape use. Organic sheet mulches, also a problem because they're going to create that same kind of damaging conditions for the soil in terms of reducing oxygen uptake and water infiltration. When they dry out, they will become dry and they become hydrophobic, and it takes a lot to get them hydrophilic again. So in other words, if you've got exposed newspaper, cardboard, whatever, it becomes dry, and then water applied to it's going to mostly run off until it rains enough or there's enough irrigation to completely rehydrate it, and then it will become hydrophilic. The other thing about these sheet mulches that kind of surprises people, especially because they think sometimes that wood chips are going to attract pests. Wood chips actually don't attract pests, but newspaper and especially cardboard mulches do. And that's something to keep in mind, that neither newspaper nor cardboard is going to be resistant to pests. So you've probably seen pictures like this before, where you've got some kind of weed control fabric, and I use the term loosely, to keep weeds out and protect, and I use that term loosely, trees from the competition for weeds. And so what happens with these fabrics, even though they're advertised as being permeable, and you can see, especially in the close-up on the right-hand side, that there's those little pores there, plus some holes, that's the water and air can move through that. But within about 30 seconds of application, those little holes are going to be filled up with soil particles. And so it becomes just a impermeable sheet onto which soil blows, weed seeds blow, and now you have this really nice substrate for weeds. It's got lots of oxygen, water's going to be held there, all kinds of stuff blows in, organic material blows in, so it becomes a really easy area for weeds to grow. In the meantime, the roots of the desirable plants are being completely without either access to the water and nutrients and oxygen that the weeds are eagerly using. So what happens with the desirable plants, of course, they send their roots up and over the mulches whenever they can, which makes it doubly difficult if and when landscape managers finally get a clue and decide to remove that fabric or plastic. Then they're also tearing up the roots of their desirable plants. So the best thing to do is just not use this stuff. It really does not benefit any kind of landscape, which is a long-term situation. It's not like crops where you're applying and reapplying things on a yearly basis. In landscape, it's a permanent installation. So we have to treat it as a permanent installation. Rubber mulches, I guess some people think they're attractive. They certainly are advertised as being a great thing to use because they're, environmentally conscious, because now we're recycling tires. But the problem is, of course, now you're using material that is not naturally found in landscapes. It also is very flammable, and in independent tests, and at least 2 universities have done this before, where they've set different types of mulches on fire, that rubber burns the hottest and the longest. And so it is definitely the worst choice in terms of any kind of landscape that is subject to fires. And as we get a hotter, drier climate, we have more and more areas that are subject to pretty intense fires, and rubber mulch will just make that worse. The interesting thing is that the EPA considers disposing of rubber tires, like on the right-hand side there, as being a pollutant, because the leachates will kill fish and do all kinds of other things. Yet there doesn't seem to be anything from EPA saying that it's a problem by grinding up those very same tires and then putting them on the soil in a landscape. It's the same material, but it's not regulated. And so this is one of the problems with a lot of things that are landscape use products, is that unless they're advertised and sold as either fertilizers or pesticides, there is no regulation. And manufacturers can say anything they want. So it really is let the buyer beware, because there is no regulatory agency to make sure that these products, unless they're fertilizers or pesticides, have any kind of verified use in a landscape. And many times they tend to be more harmful than doing nothing at all. So this is where I run into a lot of problems with a lot of gardeners, especially. They really, really like their organic sheet mulches like cardboard and burlap and newspaper and all kinds of other things that they can lay on the soil. And the reason they do this, and it's almost invariable that when I ask, well, why do you put this stuff down? And their response is, I want to smother weeds. What I tell them is that smothering is not a good verb to use when you're talking about a living system like a soil bed. And weeds don't really care. Weeds are weeds for a reason, because they can grow under pretty dire conditions. But doing this type of thing where you've got these sheet mulches down on top of soil, when they get wet, they are really, really wet. And when they dry out, they're really dry. In the meantime, the fact that they're covering the soil reduces the amount of oxygen that can get in and reduces the movement of water either into or out of the soil. They're particularly popular in a practice called lasagna mulching, which is something that is promoted by permaculture, and it's become a really hot topic among home gardeners as well. This is an emotional appeal. It's not a scientific appeal. There's no research behind lasagna mulching at all. It's all anecdotal. But people hear the word lasagna, they think yum, yum. And then they say, oh, it's a do-it-yourself recipe for making a lasagna on top of your soil. And because we love to eat lasagna, certainly our soil will love lasagna mulch. So it's just these layers of cardboard and compost to make a lasagna. And you're told you can make it as deep as you want. And proponents often recommend making it 12 to 18 inches deep, which is seriously a huge mistake to make. The reason is because, as I mentioned, cardboard is a POW mulch. It reduces oxygen and water moving in and out of the soil. If it wasn't this kind of material, pizzas would not be shipped in cardboard boxes. Amazon would not use cardboard boxes. When corrugated cardboard is made, it is impermeated with waxes or other types of resistant materials to keep them from breaking down. It's not that they won't break down. We know they do eventually. But if you can make a duck pond and a corrugated box, that tells you that it's pretty much watertight for a while. And when things are buried, as cardboard is, when it's put into a lasagna mulch, there's little oxygen available. And what happens is the cardboard doesn't break down rapidly because there's not enough oxygen for the microbes to do that. So it's a very slow process, and it's not a good thing to put on top of our soils. Because there is absolutely no research on cardboard or lasagna mulching at all, we took it upon ourselves to do some research to kind of set some standards in terms of what different mulches will do in terms of gas permeability into the soil. So we looked both at oxygen availability as well as carbon dioxide movement out of soils. And to do this, we used what we call mesocosms. Mesocosms are larger than microcosms. And so these are just basically buckets, but they're very specially constructed to be airtight once their lids are on. And so inside these buckets, we have soil, same amount of soil in each bucket. All of them have been inoculated with compost. So they all have this living microbial population. Some of them were covered with different types of mulch. And then all of them, as you can see, have these ports. And this is for sampling the gas both above the mulch material as well as within the soil itself. So you have two numbers for each carbon dioxide and for oxygen. And you can see the difference between those two numbers. And then using a whole bunch of complicated math, all involving calculus, which is not my favorite subject. And you can figure out the rate of movement of these gases during these mulches into or out of the soil. What we did is we had a control, and the control was not treated with anything. It was just bare soil. And I will say that the only reason that we do this is so that we have a standard to measure against. You will not find a bare soil that is fluffy and permeable like we have in our experiment. So our bare soil comes out being, of course, the best because it's not covered with anything and it's very porous and permeable. That would never happen in real life, but it's what we have to do to get some numbers to look at. We used a black plastic mulch, 1 sheet. We used 4 inches of arborist wood chips and 1 sheet of landscape fabric plus arborist chips on top. A lot of people do that because they're trying to hide how ugly the fabric is. 1 sheet of cardboard and a sheet of cardboard plus arborist chips on top. So there are many permutations of this, plus other materials we didn't use, but experiments dictate the number of treatments you can do because of budget restrictions, space restrictions, time restrictions, whatever. But these were 6 treatments to look at that would be commonly used either by gardeners or by landscape professionals. So to collect the data, we have some various systems. One is the Lycor gas analyzer, which analyzes carbon dioxide levels. We also had an oxygen gas analyzer. And in this last picture, you can see here the mesocosm is with the lid on top, keeping everything airtight. So there's no exchange with the atmosphere at this point. And it's hooked up to various machines to collect all kinds of data. And then in terms of the gas sampling, you can see these ports here at the bottom with the orange caps. Those are the 2 gas sampling outlets. And here we're taking some aliquots from the bottom one, when this is the one that's in the soil, and the one above that is one that's above the mulch layer. And then we're just inserting those into these 2 analyzers to find out how much carbon dioxide and how much oxygen is in each one. So it's pretty clear how we're doing this. So we published this. It's in the peer-reviewed literature. We published it in 2019. And it's a very, as I said, very mathematically heavy article. I still invite you to read it. But what I did is I took the data from it and I created a graph because this is kind of a take-home message and it's practical application. So what I want you to see from this, we're looking specifically here at carbon dioxide movement. Oxygen movement was similar, of course. Along the y-axis is the diffusion coefficient. And the nice thing about a diffusion coefficient is that it's it's standard for any mulch type. So it doesn't matter if it's raining or windy or dry or what the issue is, this diffusion coefficient is a standard number. And that's really helpful because then regardless of what the environment is doing, you can make some comparisons between different types of mulch on how much they're going to affect carbon dioxide movement in this case. Along the bottom, we've got the treatments. And what I want you to see on this, the hatch marks of the graph is that this is an exponential function. So in other words, the difference between each of these hatch marks is a factor of 10. So it's like pH scale or earthquake scale. It's a factor of 10 between all the hatch marks. So as I mentioned, bare soil, nice and fluffy. It had the highest diffusion coefficient because it doesn't have anything on top of it. The wood chips were the next best choice. And as you can see by looking, it's a little, it's less than tenfold reduction in carbon dioxide movement. Cardboard in comparison to wood chips is 10 times worse. Landscape fabric in comparison to the cardboard is almost 100 times worse. And black plastic mulch is over 10 times worse than the fabric. So working backwards, depending on however you want to look at this, the plastic mulch was 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 times worse than wood chips or bare soil, roughly speaking. So this is a really useful chart because it tells you exactly what's going to happen when you put this material on your soils. Of course, there's going to be all kinds of other factors that are going to come into play, but it's just a good comparison to show you what's going to happen in terms of gas movement. So this is the article, in case you're interested in it. As I said, it came out in 2019 in Soil and Tillage Research. All of my collaborators were either soil scientists or soil engineers here in the middle. And the one thing that I felt was most important for me to contribute was one of the things in the abstract, because of course I want there to be usage with this information, not just, doing it for other researchers to read about. And so what we stated, and all the authors agreed, that among mulches we tested, wood chips are the preferred method of mulching in terms of providing best gas permeability, particularly in landscape conditions. So this is a really helpful thing to have as a guide when you're trying to talk to somebody and talk them out of wanting to have fabric or cloth or whatever. This is, as far as I know, the only peer-reviewed research that's published that shows these differences. And it's a really useful thing to have, especially my little chart that I made. We don't want to smother weeds. That's not a good method of weed control because weeds are growing in the soil and soil needs oxygen. There is, it's a limiting factor for things, especially plant roots. And so we know mulching should protect soil life, not smother it to death. Sheet mulch, as we know, restrict oxygen and water movement. What we need to do is think about what weeds need that nothing else in the soil really needs. And the answer is sunlight. The things that live in the soil are living in a dark environment. They don't need sunlight to survive. They either can come up and do whatever they need on the soil surface, or if they're plants, they provide energy for their roots, through photosynthesis and the photosynthate that's being transferred down underground. So we have to just get rid of the sunlight. That's the easy thing. So how do we go around that? We'll talk about. So we know that seeds that are photodormant, in other words, ones that are dormant until they germinate, need light. These are usually really small seeds. Weed seeds tend to be pretty small. So if we can put enough stuff on top of the soil that does not interfere with gas movement and water movement, but does interfere with sunlight, then we can get rid of the photodormant seed problem. Perennial weeds that die back to the ground and then come back, they need light at the beginning of the season so that they have enough energy for the shoots that are emerging from their crowns. Soil organisms, by and large, do not need light because it's not part of their natural environment. So what we know from research over decades, and this is researchers all over the world, that we have the best results if we use a deep coarse mulch that restricts light but has little effect on oxygen and water movement. So that's the best thing, is a deep coarse mulch. What I've suggested to people who say, well, okay, if I can't do lasagna gardening, how can I get rid of my lawn? Because many people do want to get rid of their lawns if they find those are, resource heavy and maybe aren't as useful to their landscape, is taking all the resources away by mowing them to the ground in the summer for my part of the country, because we're really dry right now. We're in droughty conditions. In the east, especially farther in the northeast and in central part of the U.S., lawns die back in the winter. And so you do this in the fall because you're not going to have a lot of regrowth because there's something that's limiting the lawn. In your case, it would be cold. In my case, it's water. And then you just add wood chips on top. And I recommend a 12-inch layer and just letting it sit because this does not interfere with water movement. It has little effect on oxygen and carbon dioxide movement, has some, but not in a major way, of course. And then you just let it sit there. And the light is restricted from getting to the grass, which now you've loaded to the ground. And there's not that many resources left in the roots. And it does not have enough energy to put new shoots through that thick layer. And you just leave this layer on there for a set amount of time. And that varies depending on your conditions. And you move the wood chips aside when you're done, and then you plant what you want to plant there. And the turf will be gone. You will not have dug anything up. You will not have thrown anything away. You're keeping the organic matter there, and that's going to help the soil in the long run. So then the question is, what kind of organic mulches? And there's many, many sorts. There's wood chip mulch, as I mentioned, and that isn't necessarily an arborist chip mulch. An arborist chip mulch is coming right off the truck. The wood chip mulch might be something that's been shredded finely, or it might be something that's been composted, and that's not necessarily bad, but it can be. The middle one there, the screen composted mulch, is very fine. It's kind of like coffee grounds. People tend to love it because it looks so nice and uniform. It's a bad choice, as is fine bark. So if you had to choose one of these three, the wood chip mulch would be the best, but those particular ones are pretty darn fine and not as good as the things that come off the arborist truck. The fine textured mulches have the same types of problems that the sheet mulches do, in that they are small particles. That means they're small pore space. That means gases and water pass through them much less readily than they do with coarser mulches. So sawdust, compost, any of these things are going to create low oxygen conditions if you put them deeply. So if we know that we need to have a deep layer of mulch to keep weeds out, putting a deep layer of fine mulch of some sort is going to be inhibitory to oxygen in the soil. So if you use thin layers because you're worried about oxygen, then you're going to get weed growth. And so compost used in this way, and some people do, they'll put down 2 or 3 inches of compost because they think that they're putting down a great mulch. And sure, it's great for nourishing the soil, but that includes the weeds. And so thin layers of things, especially like compost, you will get a slew of weeds coming through because it's great conditions for the weeds. The hydrophobic mulches, I kind of mentioned before, bark in particular is, even though it was that great marketing thing in terms of getting rid of a forestry waste product by chopping it up and calling it beauty bark, it is not a good choice for landscapes because the function of bark on a tree is to keep water in and keep other things out. So it is a pretty tough resistant layer of stuff that includes waxes. So if you take a pretty tough resistant layer of plant material that contains waxes and you chop it up and put it on top of your soil, you're going to have, a pretty hydrophobic mulch layer. And it depends on, of course, how composted this stuff is. A composted bark can be fine in terms of not interfering, but in our part of the country, when we're looking at some pretty, especially fire-resistant species that have a very thick resistant bark, you can dig down underneath this bark and the soil will be bone dry. There's just nothing there. So bark isn't a great choice. Nutshells and dried needles, likewise, are very unlikely to absorb water because of the materials that they're also protective materials and they don't break down all that rapidly. But I think they're fine to use in certain circumstances. So for instance, if you want to have a walkway and you don't want to use stone or some other type of inorganic material, maybe you have a bark walkway. Maybe you have pine needles or nutshells or whatever. And that's fine because the main purpose in that case is to provide a walking path, not to necessarily nurture plants. So using these things is a fine use in certain circumstances, but not when your goal is to protect soil. In other words, for the soil life itself as well as for plant roots. So I really like coarse wood chip mulches. I've been using them and researching them since about 1999. And the more work that's been done and the more robust the literature gets, the more I really love these mulches and really recommend them over and above anything else. They are a sustainable source of nutrients and organic matter, but it's not fast food. It's what I call low and slow. You get low levels at a slow rate. It's unlike compost, which I kind of consider to be fast food because it breaks down relatively rapidly and those nutrients are here and then they're gone. They also really protect and enhance soil ecosystems. There are relatively few, if any, drawbacks from using coarse wood chip mulches on landscapes. And because you can do deep layers of them and not interfere with water and gas movement, you can use them for weed control. So using a fairly thin layer, and by thin, I mean anything under 4 inches, it does a lot of good for the soil, but it's not going to control weeds. You'll start seeing weeds coming through when you get to about 3 to 3.5 inches, and then the weeds are really going crazy. So for weed control, you really do have to use deep layers. We know that not only are there certain microbes, especially mycorrhizal fungi, that are just critically necessary to woody plant health and other plants besides woody plants, but they also need the wood chip mulch, or at least a source of decaying woody debris. And the reason is that not only are the mycorrhizal fungi symbiotic partners with plant roots, in other words, they will help take up water and nutrients, they also need that source of decaying material because they are decomposers. They're not pathogens, but they do decompose dead wood. And so they will extract a lot of things from the decomposing wood, and that enhances their health, which will enhance root health as well. And by having a really robust beneficial microbial sheath around all of the fine roots, it keeps them from being infiltrated by pathogens. So it just does a whole bunch of good stuff that other mulches cannot do. So there is no other mulch except for a wood chip mulch that will provide the necessary decaying woody material for mycorrhizae. People do have concerns about wood chips. The main one tends to be a belief that because this is a high CN, carbon to nitrogen ratio material, that will cause a nitrogen deficiency if you use it. And the second concern people have is about using diseased wood and making that into chips. Fortunately, there's been lots of research on both of these perceived problems. These are some data from one of the trials that one of my grad students did several years ago, looking at different depths and coarseness of different types of wood chips. And he, of course, did some measurements of pH and carbon nitrogen ratios before and during the treatments. And what I want you to see by looking at this chart is that the pH values here we have before the trials, and then we have all these different treatments or controls, is that the numbers really don't differ that much. And in fact, statistically, they're not different. So we could say without question that there were no significant differences in pH or carbon nitrogen ratios comparing something that was completely unused in terms of, this is before the trial, so it's not being used for anything. And even the controls, comparing those to the treatments, there just was no statistically significant differences. Not a worry in terms of carbon to nitrogen ratio, in other words, the nitrogen deficiency issue. And as an aside, it doesn't change the pH of the soil either. And we can see this. We can see this. We can see this anecdotally. Everybody can see this. But if you find landscapes, especially restoration sites where deep levels of wood chips have been found, there's all kinds of things that eventually, that if they were already there, they grow fine. And even things that have large root reserves like acorns, they'll grow right through that. And you don't see nitrogen deficiencies in the leaves. So that's the indicator. If you don't see nitrogen deficiencies, you don't have a nitrogen deficiency. If, on the other hand, you mix the chips into the soil, and we did this experimentally to show what would happen, then you're going to have nitrogen deficiencies being quite apparent, because now the microbes in the wood chips are mixed into the soil. The microbes are going to use most of the available nitrogen, and so the plants will suffer and have that deficiency. The fungal communities of wood chips, by and large, are decomposers. And the reason is that if you have a healthy soil system, and what I mean by that is that it's well aerated, it's going to have aerobes. It's not going to have anaerobes. So the fungal species that are active in a wood chip mulch are decomposers. They are not pathogens. So again, healthy soils, you're going to have lots of beneficial and harmless fungi, and they will outcompete pathogens for space. And that means on the plant roots and just in terms of the physical space they need. The pathogens prefer conditions that are less aerated, and that's kind of more of their environment, and that's when the aerobes start to become less prevalent. So if you have a healthy soil, if you have healthy plants, then you can take a diseased wood chip or I should say, wood chips made from diseased trees that have been killed by things like Armillaria, Phytophthora, Thyronectaria, and several others, and they will not infect the existing plants. And the reason is that to keep being an active colony, they have to have a pretty good chunk of wood to be present in. And then by the good chunk, I mean like large branches, not like wood chips. And so wood chips just don't have active disease organisms in them. The spores are always there. Spores are everywhere. But to get them to germinate, of course, you've got the disease triangle. You have to have the pathogen. You have to have the host. And most importantly, in this case, you have to have the right environmental conditions. And an aerated system where you have lots of beneficial and harmless microbes is going to keep pathogens from becoming active. So here's a picture I wanted to show you in terms of weed control, since this is a pest talk. And this is again for my student who was doing some work looking at different types and depths and coarseness issues with mulches. And so this is his plots. The center of each of those plots has a single tree growing in it. And there's different sources of wood here. While the arborist chips are the ones that are kind of light colored. The darker colored ones is wood chip mulch made from recovered lumber. And then, of course, we have different depths. And then the ones that are blank, those are the controls. So this is after installation, so everything looks nice and clean. About 3 months later, the weeds come back with vengeance because there's a huge weed seed bank in this area. So everything in between the plots is covered with weeds. And you can see that, especially in some of the thinner plots, you have weeds that are encroaching into the mulch itself. A year later, it looks like this. And what I want to show you is that some of these, as you can see here in the foreground, this really tall one, which is 12 inches deep, it has its tree in the middle. And you can see some other ones back there. And I will tell you that after 2 years of this, we had 0 weeds in any of the 12-inch layers. And of course, the thinner it got, the more weeds were there. So we didn't do any kind of maintenance here because that wasn't the point. The point was to see what happens if you use this mulch, especially if you're going to be in a kind of a low maintenance or no maintenance environment. So the deeper the chip was, the fewer weeds could infiltrate and get in there, meaning that during those 1 or 2 years, all of the nutrients and space and the water was available to the plant that was in the middle of each of those plots. So we want to remember that if we use deep layers of woody mulch, that's going to be best for suppressing weeds as well as enhancing existing plants. It really is the best choice. They're low and slow, and they last for a while. You're going to have to replace it depending on how deep you installed it in the first place. Understanding the deeper you put it down in the first place, the less frequently you have to add more. For a residential area, it might be that your clients don't want 12 inches of wood chips, and that's fine. I use them, and I don't put down 12 inches. So I have to reapply every 6 months or so. And the nice thing is that after you use them, if you don't want them as part of landscape, you can use them elsewhere. It's something that's eminently recyclable until it's gone. So what I suggest for folks that are thinking about ways of incorporating some more soil-friendly mulches into landscapes is, first of all, make sure you have soil tests. And the reason is, as I mentioned, a lot of people like to use compost either as a mulch itself, or they think, the wood chip is so carbon and nitrogen high and not many nutrients, so we need to supply something. And a soil test will be the fastest way to see whether you need to do something or not. And so this is actually a soil test from my landscape. And as you can tell, looking at it, on the optimal levels of almost everything, a little low on phosphorus, but it's not deficient. And interestingly enough, you compare it to something else where it has been a lot of compost applied, everything's off scale. And that's where you certainly don't want to apply anything at all. And if you're using a mulch, you would use a wood chip mulch and nothing else, because it's not going to contribute really quickly to the nutrient overload. And the nutrients will eventually. But look here. So with my soils, with my nutrients at optimum, and comparing to this other one, my organic matter in my soil is 12.8%, which I would have told you 5 years ago was too high. But you can kind of see from my picture in the background of my little box there, we have a lot of oak trees on our property, and they're centuries old. And so centuries worth of oak leaves getting broken down and incorporated into soil means we have really high soil organic matter, but not too much for our system. So what we're learning is that there is no real ideal soil organic material. It really is site dependent. What you have to do is match up your organic material with what is read in your soil test. And if you have optimal levels of nutrients, then your soil organic matter is just right. If you have too many nutrients, doesn't matter that the soil organic matter in this case is 8.7%, it's too much. And this person just liked to use lots of compost, and she has to cut back because she's got nutrient overload. So my point is to have a soil test before you do any addition of anything to the top of the soil, with the exception of arborist wood chips, to have a soil test done and reduce compost, reduce fertilizer if you have numbers that are at toxic levels. Think about the roots. Roots need water. We need to know this. They need nutrients. We know this. They need oxygen. A lot of people forget this. And they also forget about the microbial partners. And so we need to think about the fact that we've got a beneficial fungi, beneficial bacteria, and the need for oxygen for all of those things and the roots to have healthy plants. What people have found when they've switched over to using wood chips instead of some other type of mulch, or using not in cases where they may not have even used a mulch, is that all of a sudden weeds don't become their major problem. Their major problem becomes pruning, because things grow so well and require less additional water, because water is held in the soil better. And so they just find their plants take off. And sometimes that just, especially plants that are kind of in a crowded area, requires more pruning. So that's the only drawback I can even mention, is that you might find yourself having to do more pruning as a result of using the wood chip mulch. And then, have fun with mulches. This is actually from our landscape of our little tiny landscape in Seattle before I moved down to a family farm. And so you can see I've got a bunch of different things here. I've got wood chips. I've got inorganic mulch. I've got living mulches because we had sufficient water to support those. And then, of course, the stones for heavy traffic. And then, of course, wood chips covering all the bare soil except underneath really shaded plants. And so you can see our rhododendrons here in the back. They're actually bare underneath because it's dark and shaded. Same with underneath the Japanese maple. And we left those bare to provide habitat for ground nesting bees and other types of beneficial organisms. I will say, since we're talking about pests anyway, and there was just something that came out in Entomology Today's blog, that we need to start using predaceous ground beetles as more of a natural way to control slugs. So anecdotally, I can tell you that ever since I started using wood chips over 20 years ago in my landscape, that our slug problem has dropped to nothing. And so you can even see I've got a hosta here in the foreground, and it was never eaten by slugs. We just didn't have slug problems, even though we had before. I didn't have any real good explanation for this until I discovered, as you do, that if you're using wood chips, you have a real interesting host of insects and arthropods, like spiders, that live in the wood chips, and they're predaceous. So there's a whole bunch of predaceous ground beetles that live in arborist chips, or live in landscapes that have arborist chips, and they eat slugs and slug eggs. So even though there hasn't been definitive research showing that wood chips, have more ground beetles and have fewer slugs, the Entomology Today is now recommending that people use predaceous ground beetles as part of a natural control, and knowing that their habitat is this kind of coarse woody material, it's a great thing to try to see what happens in terms of slug damage. So in terms of information for this particular talk, I have a few articles that are out there, and they're all free downloads. And the first one I did was in 2007. That's on the upper left-hand corner, which just kind of reviews a lot of information at the time about different mulches that were used around landscape plants. And that kind of got me into doing more and more publications and research on mulches in general. So the other two that I've got, the one at the bottom left-hand here is in the Journal of the NACCA, which is the National Association for County Agricultural Agents. So it's an extension group, and I'm not an ag agent, I am a specialist, and so I train agents. And so this has been a really good venue for me and one of my colleagues to try to share information with a lot of ag agents who might not be experts on mulches, which you can't expect your agents to be experts on everything. So we've given them a good resource with lots of citations and data about using arborist wood chips as landscape mulches. And then the last one here on the right is a peer-reviewed fact sheet from Washington State. And it's, meant for clients to use or master gardeners, other people who want the information, especially kind of a how-to approach and aren't necessarily interested in reading all of the research, although the research is cited within it. So those are some good resources. And I said they're all available online for free. I also have online, this is the beginning of kind of getting into my myth busting. I started doing these monthly myth columns for our state Nursery and Landscape Association magazine, and then I stuck them all up on the web. So this is something where you can find what I call white papers, which means that they're science-based, but they haven't been through peer review, but they're just meant as free informational sheets on the state of the science of a variety of different topics. I try to keep all of my peer-reviewed stuff on ResearchGate, and all of these websites are on the handout that you can download. So on the very last page of the handout, you'll see there's all kinds of websites so you can easily find where these spots are. So I try to keep all of my research on this site because that way you don't have to go to a whole bunch of different journals and try to download stuff. It's all in one easy area. We have a blog that I and some of my colleagues started back in 2009, and all of the other three original garden professors aren't doing this anymore. They're doing other things. I'm still with it, and we've recruited other people to also contribute to the blog once a week. So we write on all kinds of stuff. We've got a pathologist. We've got a professor who does research on vegetable gardens. I do a lot of stuff on woody plant physiology as well as mulch. And then we even have the state climatologist from Georgia, and that's Pam Knox. And some of you might know her, and she's one of the contributors to the blog. So it's a really fun site, and it has archives going all the way back to 2009. So if you were to type into the search box here, any topic you want, you'll find anything that mentions that particular word or string of words. We also have a Facebook page. And the page itself is kind of a clearinghouse for interesting information. So, for instance, I told you about the Entomology Today blog and this whole thing about predaceous ground beetles and slugs. And so we'll have links to things like that. So it's a clearinghouse for good information. And sometimes it's just something fun, but it's a reliable and credible source of information for people to just kind of peruse. But probably the thing that I think is most fun and useful for people to use because it's active and it's not kind of a top-down approach is our garden professors blog group. And so this is a group that's administrated by, I think I've got 13 volunteer administrators now to make sure that everything's science-based in terms of recommendations. We don't do home remedies. We don't do anecdotes. We don't do it yourself. And we certainly don't recommend anything that if it hasn't been vetted scientifically or is supported by known science. And so it's the only group that I'm familiar with on Facebook or any place else that has that kind of philosophy. And right now we've got almost 27,000 members, which means there's always somebody on here because there's people all over the world that are part of this. And that's a bunch of experts and other people who may not be academically trained experts, but have read and understand and will promote good science. It's a fun group. If you've got a question, you can always check the archives to see if it's been answered. Many times we have answered the questions, but sometimes it'll be a new question. So it's a fun thing to join. And if you do decide to join it, be aware that you have to answer 3 questions that are not hard, but it's just a way to make sure you're a real person. And if you don't answer the questions, they won't let you in. So answer 3 questions and come join us. And with that, I will turn it back over and take some questions.
So much, Linda. Really appreciate it. It was an excellent talk.
Thank you.
So this is time for questions. So if you have any questions, think about it, take a few minutes. We'll be here we have time, enough time. So you can put your questions into that Q&A box there, you click there and type your question. Okay. And I can read out to Linda as it comes in.
Okay.
So Linda, we have one question. I don't completely understand the question that well, but I will just read it out. Okay. Okay. Where did you get that soil test? And what is the name of it? Showing amounts of organic matter.
Okay. Good question. So Unfortunately, our university does not any longer take soil tests from the public. And so I've been using the soil testing lab at University of Massachusetts at Amherst. They have a really easy to navigate website. If you just go to soil tests Amherst, it'll pop up as the first thing. And they have lots of different options when you do a soil test. So in other words, you'll get the nutrient analysis as kind of a basic thing. If you want the organic matter content, and in my opinion, that's a critical thing to have, you just check off a box that says you want to have the organic matter analyzed. And in total, the test will run you about $25. And it's a bargain. It comes with interpretive literature. The thing I like about UMass Amherst is that they have worked with home gardeners and landscapes for decades. And so it's one of the things you'll check off in terms of how you're using your soil. Is it for an annual bed? Is it for shrubs and trees? Is it for lawn? So they will know exactly how you're using your soil and how you want to use it. And then the recommendations will be geared towards those particular plants.
Great. We have a second question.
Okay.
The slate chips okay to put around maple trees? Slate chips.
You can, and as I said, I like lots of different types of inorganic mulches, but it's not as beneficial as a woody mulch. It keeps the grass away. It kind of protects the root zone, but it doesn't have all the benefits that the wood chip mulches do. But there's nothing wrong with slate in general.
Great. We have another question. Any research related to impacts related to dyes in mulches? Red, brown, black dyes in shredded mulch?
It's another good question. So I think that years and years ago, they used to use things that weren't so friendly in terms of using dyes. But now my understanding is that these are all food safe dyes. So they're all things that they get broken down pretty quickly. So that's the drawback, but they are all safe dyes. It's nothing it doesn't have anything like lead or anything in it.
Great. And there's a follow-up question. Is there any link for the UMass Amherst soil test?
Not okay. I wish I could remember it, but if you just go onto Google and put down in quotation marks, put down soil test, and then put UMass Amherst, it'll pop right up. It'll be their homepage, and I said a very easy to navigate site. And all you do, it'll tell you how to take the soil samples. It tells you how to mail them in, and then they will email you the results.
Great. So, if you have any questions, please go ahead and use that Q&A box and type your question. We still have a couple more minutes.
Okay.
Since you're waiting for another question, let me ask you, we got more questions here. Talk about the evils of using cypress mulch. Does it deplete habitats?
I guess that means what you mean by the evils. I mean, if you're using trees.
I don't go back to maybe that's what they're something.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're using a tree that's, and all you're doing is chipping up and using it as a mulch, and that's depleting cypress grows, that would be bad. But in terms of mulch types, different kinds of wood, as long as it's not just bark, but actually wood, it has all the benefits that any other wood chip mulch would have. So I'm guessing the question has to do with removing cypress trees and chipping them up, maybe. But I don't know, because we don't have any cypress trees.
So the other question is, are there any negative impacts to using the pine straw mulch?
The main problem is it doesn't absorb water. And so, I mean, you'll put water on it and water will just you run right through it. It doesn't retain any water. But that's not, that's about its only drawback, is that it's just not something that will absorb and release water slowly. So if you have a downpour, what I've noticed with deep layers of wood chip mulch is that it absorbs a lot of that like a sponge. The pine straw can't, because it's heavily lignified and it just can't absorb all that water. But all the other things that it does as a mulch are great. And it's, as I said, it's natural to pine forests. And so using it as a mulch, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. So I'm not going to say you shouldn't use it.
Great. So does the creeping Jenny act as a mulch or a weed deterrent?
Creeping Jenny is invasive, and I certainly wouldn't use it at all because it just overtakes landscapes. So, sure, it's a mulch. Any kind of ground cover would be considered a mulch, whether it's a wheat or not. And it'll keep other things out, but it also becomes very invasive and gets into places where you don't want it.
Great. One more question. What would you say the best mulch covering would be to help prevent erosion on hilly areas?
There's a great question. So I've actually done a lot of restoration and very steep sloped areas, and there's two ways to do this. So anything you initially put on, including wood chips, is going to pretty much be prone to sliding. Once it's been integrated into the landscape, in other words, it's gotten wet, you have mycorrhizal fungi growing into it, you have fine roots growing into it, then it holds itself in place. But up to that point, there's two things you can do. You can either take burlap or cork-cloth or any of those things and peg it over the top of it to keep it in place. Or you can create terraces on the hillside itself, and you can use either timbers for that, or you can use deadfall woods just to kind of create these little built-out things that will be where you have your plants and where you can put mulch, and that will keep it in place. So it just kind of depends on, what your goal is for how it's going to look, and whether it's kind of more of a tailored look with these terraces, or whether it's something where you can just pin it down with a permeable fabric like cork cloth or burlap, which will help hold it in place until it becomes part of the landscape soil.
Great. So I would call this as the last question. So we have one more question. Okay, it's about cypress mulch. Does cypress mulch really help to deter insect activity, as the manufacturers state on their bags?
It depends on what kind of insects you're looking at. So I will tell you that if you're looking at termites, don't like wood chip mulches. The favorite food of termites is cardboard. So if you want lots of termites, cardboard mulch is a great choice. I don't really know much about cypress mulch because we don't have it as a choice up here because we don't have cypress trees. But there are no insect colonies other than a lot of predaceous insects in the arborist chips that we have here in the Pacific Northwest. That's where we have the spiders and the beetles and all these other things. There are no pests in those mulches. So I'm sorry I don't know about the cypress mulch. Maybe Chris knows more about it.
That's great. Yeah, once again, thank you so much, Linda, for excellent presentation on mulches today. And thank you, okay?
You bet. Thank you.
Yeah.